Welcome to the Orthodox Ethos. Tonight we have a special guest. Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell joins us to discuss the Orthodox understanding of deaconesses and the case for the restoration of them, of the institution today. Welcome to the podcast, Father Patrick. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. We go a few years back to the time when I was a professor at the Holy Trinity Seminary, and we had I had the honor of working together with you and Archpriest Alexander Webster, and I think with quite a few others, head of the Seminary of St. Vladimir's and others, in drafting an important document, which is very pertinent to tonight's discussion, and which I think was very important back then. And we'll discuss that a bit tonight. But before we get there, let me just say a word about the title that I've given, and also introduce you a bit to the audience, although many of them, I think, will be familiar with your work, which we've promoted a number of times on our platform. I gave the title The Orthodox Deaconess, Partial Acceptance, Complete Abandonment. And that was inspired by something that you had written and we had written back in that declaration, that statement. And I'd like to talk about that as well. What happened to the deaconesses as a institution in church history? I think maybe we'll start there, the discussion. And then that's a lot of what your research went into, if I understand it correctly, for your PhD. You have a PhD from the University of Winchester in the UK.
Right.
You're a protodeacon in the Russian Orthodox Church Abroad in Washington, D.C. You have been formerly the Washington Bureau Chief of the Investor's Business Daily, a former cabinet-level speechwriter, author of 7 books on politics and religion. You have authored an important book, Origen's Revenge, the Greek and Hebrew roots of Christian thinking on male and female. I think we'll talk a bit about some of that tonight, maybe. That's published by Wipf and Stock. And of course, the one that we want to talk about tonight, the book that you've written most recently on the topic, is The Disappearing Deaconesses. How do you have the subtitle? I don't have it in front of me.
Well, the subtitle now is Why the Church Once Had Deaconesses and Then Stopped Having Them.
Yes. All right. And that's going to be a big part of our discussion tonight. So if I miss anything, let us know. But that's what I have in front of me. And again, thank you for joining us.
Good. Thank you. Glad to be here.
So maybe we should start the discussion, first of all, about the historical reality in the ancient church. That's probably the best place to start. We'll probably end up with the discussion about the contemporary situation, the attempts to restore it, the characteristics of that movement, mainly, I guess, in the United States. It seems like to me, I don't hear much about this at all in Greece. But before we get to that contemporary, very interesting things we can talk about today, let's hear about the history a bit.
Right. Yeah. The assumption a lot of people make today is that, well, we had deaconesses once, so we can have them again. And then it's really not much of a question as to why we once had them and didn't have them. But what we need to realize is that history is not tradition. History only becomes tradition when it is handed down, and deaconesses really haven't been handed down to us, not for many centuries, actually. In fact, the whole church has never had a tradition of deaconesses, but the whole church has had a tradition of not having deaconesses for quite a long time. And the question is, why is that? Why did only part of the church have deaconesses, and why did they only have deaconesses for a while? And that part that had deaconesses was largely the East, probably Syria, centered on Syria, Asia Minor, the area around Constantinople. They had deaconesses. That's where they first appear. And a couple of reasons for that. One is that, well, Easterners were historically more concerned about the modesty of women. And that was the reason for the existence of deaconesses. Even the given reason there in the 3rd century in the Didascalia was to protect the modesty of women, to assist in baptism, which was done naked, so that a man didn't have to slather oil all over a woman being baptized, to also take communion on Pascha to women who were shut in because they'd just given birth or what. That was something that in certain parts of the world a man couldn't do. A single man or a man couldn't go to a woman at her home except in the company of other men, her family. And so deaconesses, well, they could do that. They could go in and visit with women in their homes there. So it was about modesty. The other reason, though, is that it only appears in the West. It's only in the West that people are reading St. Paul's epistle to the Romans in Greek, and they're seeing that he calls St. Phoebe of Cenchreae a deaconess of Cenchreae. He actually uses the word diakonos. It's a male form of a word. He uses the feminine article to indicate that it's a woman, but nevertheless, he calls her a diakonos. Now, in the New Testament, that word is used many times, and it very rarely means a deacon, actually. It almost always simply means a trusted servant. The men who serve the wine at the wedding feast of Cana are called diakonoi. St. Paul himself calls the emperor a diakonos of God, a servant of God, minister of God. And he names half a dozen other people who we don't remember as deacons as nevertheless being diakonos. He calls himself a diakonos, and he calls Christ diakonos, and then Epaphras and Apollos and Tychicus. And none of these men are really remembered as deaconesses.
I suppose in those contexts, if we were to speak in English, we would say servant.
Yes, yes.
Translation?
Or minister, which was the Latin word, which meant a trusted servant to a magister, from which we get the word master. Now, minister, of course, does now mean a ordained clergy, but that's only because of its use in the church as a way of meaning, yes, a servant to a bishop, really. We still call our bishops master. And priests were called ministers because they served the magister, diminutive form of the comparative form of the word for magister. So so that's it. It's trusted servant. There are parallels to it. Other words like sergeant in the army literally mean a servant, but it was a trusted servant with some authority and whatnot. And the first deacons indeed did have authority. But in the first century, it was a general term. And it only later became rather understood as meaning a deacon of the church. And so the Easterners, when they would see Phoebe referred to as a diakonos, well, later on they began assuming that must mean that she was a deacon of the church, when in fact, well, not necessarily. We do have clear indication early on that many people in the East are making this assumption. The earliest reference we have is Pliny's letter to the Emperor Trajan in about 212, early 2nd century, where he mentions having interrogated 2 women who are called ministrae, meaning diakonos. He's probably just translating the word. And so clearly some people some Christians in the East did already have deaconesses of some sort there by that time. We get later mentions, mainly from Clement of Alexandria, and then also Origen of Alexandria, where they're referencing scripture. They're reading scripture and they're giving this interpretation to scripture too, saying that there are deaconesses in the church, although they don't give any indication that they know of any deaconesses or that they've ever seen one. It's only in the 3rd century. Well, in the 3rd century, you get another work also from the area of Syria, Didascalia Apostolorum, which advocates making women deaconesses. Doesn't actually indicate that there are any, but it does sort of say, well, deaconesses, we should appoint women as deaconesses, and their duty is to assist in baptism, and then also visiting women in their homes, and that becomes sort of their main reason for existence there. So in it, and that we see the same thing, and also in another Eastern document, the Apostolic Constitutions in the 4th century, and then also in the Testimony of our Lord in the 5th century. These are all Eastern documents. They're all pseudonymous. We don't know who wrote them. They don't have any official standing in the church. They're more of historical value than any authoritative value. In fact, the Apostolic Constitutions was somewhat criticized, if not condemned, by the Council in Trullo. The Sixth Ecumenical Council, saying that it contains adulterous material that is plain contrary to piety. But all three of those documents are main sources for knowledge of deaconesses. It's certain they only become a certain part of church history in the 4th century, and it's in the later 4th century that we actually get the names of some deaconesses. The only one we know really much about at all is Saint Olympias, who is the friend of St. John Chrysostom, and we know about her because of her friendship with St. John. And she was certainly a deaconess, by all means, in Constantinople. She was a young aristocratic woman who married a man and then was suddenly widowed before she'd had children. She was very pious and wanted to serve the church. She didn't want to remarry. Saint Theodosius the Great, the emperor at the time, did want her to remarry and sequestered her fortune until she turned 30. But as soon as she got her fortune, she had herself made a deaconess by the hierarch at the time, before St. John's time there. And as a result, St. Theodosius then passed a law saying that deaconesses had to be 60 years old, taking the number 60 from St. Paul's reference to widows having to be 60 years old. That was later lowered to 40 by the Council of Chalcedon. It was raised to 50 by St. Justinian in the 6th century, and then lowered again to, or confirmed at 40 by the 6th Ecumenical Council later on. So, and it's pretty much 40. Moved around a bit, but you're still talking about a mature woman who had to be celibate. She could not have been married and still living with her husband. She would not have the care of children. She would have to be on her own, and by and large, it became ultimately a monastic rite, where senior women in monasteries would sometimes be made deaconesses. Aristocratic women who were very pious could be, in a sense, brought into the church and made deaconesses and given a role commensurate with their social standing and their wealth. And they made great leaders. People like St. Hilda of Whitby, who was not a deaconess, but nevertheless she was an Anglo-Saxon princess and was a founder of monasteries. And when you're a princess, you have that standing and you have that wealth. Well, you can found monasteries. And some aristocratic women did that, as St. Olympias did also. And so it was a way of honoring those women and bringing them under episcopal control, because aristocratic women can sometimes be very difficult if they're not under control. And then it was also a consolation to women whose wives were or whose husbands were chosen to be bishops. They couldn't continue to cohabitate in the later years. So if the woman allowed her husband to become a bishop, then she could be receive the honor of being made a deaconess. And so that was the case. As early as the early 6th century, even while you still have a large number of deaconesses in Constantinople, you have Severus of Antioch, the Monophysite bishop of Antioch, writing to his clergy further east in Syria, saying that, well, as far as deaconesses go, it's largely an honorary office. We do this as a way of doing honor to women there. Not a lot of need for it at that point. And one of the main reasons people often cite, and it's true, is that the main duty of deaconesses had been to assist in baptism of adult women. But by the early 5th century or 6th century, most of the people in the church had already been baptized as infants, and so there was very little need for women to assist in adult baptism, and so they didn't have that. And as monasticism grew and became more formalized, the deaconesses sort of coalesced with the office of widows, and then on the office of consecrated virgins, to become simply nuns. And it was after that, there's sort of no point in having them. They did linger on in Constantinople for a while. There was the deaconesses there attached to the cathedral had their own choir. They sang together in a certain part of church. And for a long time afterwards, even though the people in the choir were really just nuns, nevertheless, they were still called deaconesses for a while. And then ultimately, apparently, came to be called myrrh-bearers. Anthony of Novgorod visits there around 1190s, and mentions the spot in the church where the myrrh-bearers, he says, sang. And that's probably deaconesses. About that same time, Theodore Balsamon, a deacon himself in Constantinople, is writing about deaconesses and saying, well, the deaconesses that we have now are not really deaconesses. They have the name, but they have no role in the altar. They don't really do anything but sing. And he's writing actually to the Patriarch of Alexandria, who wrote and asked about deaconesses, because he'd read a reference to them in the canons of Chalcedon in 451, and had no knowledge of deaconesses. They were, they don't appear very often at all in the history in the writings of the church. There's occasional mentions here and there. There's only the 2 mentions in canons of deaconesses, and other than that, it's just a very rare event to find any mention of deaconesses in the ancient texts there, which is very unlike deacons, because deacons are everywhere. They're often mentioned, they're often named. We know exactly what deacons are, what they do. Their evolution of that office is very easy to trace. It's pretty consistent over time. And that's just not the case with deaconesses. The West, by the way, had no tradition of deaconesses, neither did Egypt, actually. There's very little evidence of deaconesses in Egypt. None of the great Egyptian writers, Cyril of Alexandria or St. Athanasius the Great or Isidore Pelusium, none of them mention deaconesses, any woman serving as a deacon. And they do, of course, mention deacons. In fact, Athanasius the Great was a deacon at the First Ecumenical Council there, and then later became patriarch. And the West wasn't reading Romans 16, where Phoebe as being a deacon. It was translating the word, and so they were surprised to learn in the late 4th century that there were deaconesses, and they resisted them. There were several councils, 4 councils, that forbade their appointment. They were regarded as being an innovation of the heretics, and there were other problems. There may have been some bishops locally who tried to have them, but there's indications there that the deaconesses were having a hard time living up to their vows, that they were wanting to get married afterwards, and so it was becoming problematic. They were never really endorsed, never really accepted. And very little evidence that there were any. Very few examples that we can point to of deaconesses there. So by and large, the church just, or for the most part, just didn't see a need for them. Generally, the rule was always, even in the East, if there was no deaconess around, a laywoman could do the job, or if necessary, the clergyman could do it, say his prayers and do his best. So it wasn't really an absolute necessity. Barring that,
if I could restate the main task, at least in the East, I have it on the screen here. We have what you mentioned in our statement back years ago, the 4 councils that prohibited them. But in the East, where there was deaconesses, the main role was for baptism of women, because they were baptized without any clothing at that time.
That was it. That's the one that gets mentioned often. It's mentioned in Didascalia. It's also mentioned by St. Epiphanius of Salamis. He's writing against heretics who have female clergy, and he's condemning them for that. He's admitting, though, in doing that, there are deaconesses, and it's only to assist in anointing for baptism and tending to other issues of modesty for women.
There was no liturgical rite or for them. They didn't serve the services, the divine liturgy. They didn't serve during the services in the church, or have the exclamations or anything like that.
No, in fact, even in the Didascalia, which makes a case for deaconesses, nevertheless says what they can't do, and they can't do a lot of the things associated with being a priest. They can't bless, they can't serve at the altar, they have no vocal role in the church beyond singing as a choir there. So
now, is that seen as much? I'm kind of foreseeing the arguments for it, but just as a question here in this context, because all of society would have had the separation of roles, and women would not have had leadership roles. And some might say, well, that was then, this is now, and so it was really just a cultural thing, or it was this is, I think, one of the arguments, isn't it, for its restoration in a different light today, perhaps. We have a different climate, different perspective on women's roles. But just in its context there, how much do we think played a role, and how much of it was actually on the principle, some spiritual principles laid down by the apostles?
Well, the assumptional part of the advocates nowadays is, of course, that was then, and they had different beliefs then. They try to have it both ways in a way, because the feminists will, in a sense, they'll point to passages of the New Testament that they say represents sort of the true faith, the golden thread of real Christianity, and that's for them very egalitarianism. That's where they quote Galatians 3:20 or 3:28, where it says, neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, male nor female, or male and female is what he actually says. But they'll quote that, and they'll make a lot of that, as some Origenists do. But at the same time, they'll also say that, well, but people were different then, and they were terribly influenced by their own culture, and it's the culture that overcame this original Christianity that they see in these handful of verses and things like that. And the problem with that is it's impossible to document, because there just isn't a lot of evidence of any real change in regard for a male and female over time. You have to assume that there's this feminism at the beginning in order to see any change. And then it's just a matter that, well, anything that's not plainly feminist, well, that's evidence of change. That's all an assumed change. There was one, in rereading the book this afternoon, I do quote at length a modern scholar who himself leans towards the very feminist view on this. But he admits that if the Easterners had not thought that deaconesses were apostolic, if they hadn't read that Phoebe was a deaconess, then they never would have allowed such an office to exist, because of everything the church taught about male and female, everything else St. Paul said about males and females, men and women, everything spoke of order, spoke of the woman being made from the man being the head of the woman, 1 Corinthians 11, and also the subjection of the woman and the limits on the woman and what she could do in terms of her silence in church and her obedience and her covering and the modesty that was required. That's all there in Scripture, and then it's all there in the Fathers. One of the books I published years ago, back in 1998, was called The Scandal of Gender, which just surveyed the early Christian teaching on the man and the woman. And it's quite plain. There's no change at all. In every century, you can quote these same scriptures being used to the same purpose. There's an order here, and women can't function as leaders of men. They can't rule over men, as St. Paul says. And they're very limited in what they can do in church. And there's no real exception to this among the fathers. The slightest exception is one comment that Gregory of Nyssa makes in his writing about his sister, Saint Macrina the Younger, there, where he remarks in passing that it's a shame that someone as pious as she was should go through life veiled and silent. Which was expected of women there. But that's the closest you get to anything that any father would say that calls into question what was always considered the apostolic rule about the place of women in church there. That was just unquestioned. And so there's no way you can say, if you don't like that, well, then you don't like Christianity. And in fact, there's a feminist scholar named Daphne Hampson. She's the one who writes about the golden thread. She herself was a feminist Christian. But she became so convinced that there's so much in Christianity that's just not feminist that she gave up being a Christian. And she criticizes Christian feminists for taking this golden thread approach to Scripture, where they seize upon certain parts like neither male or female, and they make that their Christianity, and then they judge everything else accordingly. Of course, other heretics do it for other things. Martin Luther, it's justification by faith, and then that becomes everything else is subordinated to his conception of justification by faith. Well, that's exactly what feminists do. And yet it just simply cannot be borne out. And that's the shameful thing about Carrie Frost's recent book. She wrote a book just published last year, months ago, really, 6, 7, 8 months ago, called Church of Our Granddaughters. And it's really the sort of the Mein Kampf of Orthodox feminists, because she tells you exactly what they want. And it's quite extreme. She doesn't quite go as far as women priests and bishops, but she says we ought to have that conversation, and she doesn't give any reason why we shouldn't. But she, in criticizing the church for its teaching with regard to women, she ignores everything the church has ever said on the subject there. She ignores what's in the scriptures about the order between the man and the woman, and she ignores everything the fathers have said there. She just ignores it completely. and just presents only sort of her golden thread approach to what she believes is real Christianity, in order to say that the church hasn't lived up to its own theology. So it's a very dishonest approach to things. I do think, though, in talking about this, and we do need to point out, in a sense, the limitations of that argument and the approach they take. But in talking about the issue of deaconesses, we do need to come up with a better explanation for the differences. And this is what I've also tried to get to in my dissertation, which was published on Origen's Revenge, and then also some other speaking I've done on the subject and writing. Is that there are ways, there's a natural relationship between the man and the woman, and then there's the subjection that comes in with the fall. The fathers don't often clearly separate these two, because to them their experiences, well, living in the fall, they sort of run together. But it can be done. And on the one hand, the easy answer to why we shouldn't have deaconesses, and this is the answer actually that you hear from Matthew Blasteris, another canonist from the 14th century. He takes up the question of deaconesses, and he mentions some of the opinions of others who delved into the topic. He says himself that he doesn't believe they could ever have served in the altar, because they're not allowed to teach, and that's the deacon's job, was, he says, to purify by teaching. The reference to purification is from Dionysius' celestial or ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's the job he assigns to the order of deacons, or liturgists, as he calls them. And so it's, in a sense, very simple why women couldn't be deacons, because the office of deacon was an executive office. The first deacons were the 7 appointed in the 6th chapter of Acts. They were appointed to manage the church's finances, to say who got what out of the church treasury. That was their job. The apostles didn't want to get into the business of taking money and then counting it out for people. They wanted to stay away from the money for their own obvious reasons. So they assigned these men to do that. And with that is a degree of authority. And all along, deacons were the executive assistants of first apostles and then bishops. They belonged to bishops. And so when, as the church grew and bishops began sending out priests to serve parishes, to care for souls in parishes, they didn't send deacons out with the priests, because priests didn't rate deacons. Deacons assisted bishops, and they often had considerable authority managing the administration and finances. In fact, it was at times considered a demotion to take an archbishop or archdeacon and make him a priest, because you took away all his authority, all his power, and then you gave him the care of souls in a little parish. And there were bishops accusing other bishops of doing just that, just so that they could take control of the church's administration and finances there. So it was always a job of exercising some authority. Even today in our own liturgy, we have the deacon telling people what to do, very directive. Bow your heads unto the Lord. Let us attend, pay attention, the doors, all that. But they have that job of being that directive, so that priests don't have to, so that priests can stay above that level of telling people what to do. In a sense, the priest is caring for the soul outside of the fall, in a sense, without the penalty of subjection of the fall, whereas the deacon is tending to the conditions of the fall and being very directive about telling people what to do and correcting anyone who misbehaves and things like that. So, and that's why they're able to work together in a way. A very important role for deacons, which I think is sometimes neglected, but still very evident there. And from the standpoint of the fall and the subjection of women that comes from that, Genesis 3:16, there's pain in childbirth. People will mention that, but the other part of it is, and your desire shall be to your husband, and he shall rule over you. And this is universally interpreted by the fathers as meaning a matter of law. As St. John Chrysostom says, the woman is reasonably subjected to the man, for equality of honor causeth contention. He also elsewhere says, but of course it's a subjection of love, and therefore it is but slight. So it's not nearly as extreme as feminists might fear. Nevertheless, there's an order there, and that made it quite plain as that women really couldn't be deacons, and that the office had to be very limited, or did indeed threaten the understanding, the gender order of the church there. And I think that's the reason why it was never that popular, although it did exist, and there were reasons for it in terms of honoring certain women for their service, making use of them in certain useful ways, although not terribly important ways, and yet calling them deaconesses, calling them deacons, because the Byzantines went back and forth between the terms. Where deaconess doesn't come up until the First Ecumenical Council in the early 4th century. But calling them that made it problematic because, well, it made them look like deacons in a way. And there was always that danger that some deaconesses would make too much of the honor and go too far or presume to do too much. In monasteries, there is, at least in the East again, in Syria, there were cases where a woman was allowed, a deaconess was allowed to do certain things in the altar, and even commune people of the reserved sacraments. But she could only commune adult women and children under 5. She was not allowed to commune any other children. Part of growing up is learning the difference between men and women. And apparently the fathers were concerned that well, if they had deaconesses communing older children, the children might not understand that that's a priestly role that really is reserved for men. So there is this order, there's this gender order that the church was concerned to protect, which is why you didn't have deaconesses in the West, and why you eventually didn't have deaconesses in the East, and why we're now struggling against it too.
Before we go any further, let me just dial back a second, because I think they can hear some thoughts in our listeners that I'd like you to answer.
Oh, sure.
It's often presented that Christianity freed women from a much more subservient and demeaning role in the ancient world, and so the perspective of the elevation of women is often presented, and that's the success of Christianity. Which would not necessarily contradict anything you said, because what we're talking about in the church is a question of roles,
right,
not a question of value or honor per se as a human being. I mean, the ancient world was filled with slavery, and the laws didn't even recognize the rights of women many times and children. And so, can we see that properly in context? In other words, because everything is geared toward taking things out of this proper context today and understanding them properly in this context. And so that's one thought. I think some thoughts that people would have right now hearing you. Yeah. How would you address that?
Well, there's no doubt that if you're a little older, I mean, I remember the way the world was in the United States in the 50s, mid 20th century. And things were a lot more traditional then. Younger people today may not remember that. Unless you watch old movies, you may have very little idea as to how men and women actually behave towards one another there. Back then, there was an appreciation for the difference of male and female and for the order. And people were respectful of the order, much more respectful of the order than they are today. And yet it wasn't anything like the oppression that is sometimes painted as being. And you can look at all other cultures, of course, Muslim culture, also Eastern culture, many other societies where women have been treated much worse than they were among Christians or in the West generally. And Christianity did have a tendency to elevate the status of women there. Christians worshiped together, men and women. Jews didn't do that. Women didn't go to the synagogue. They stayed home and prepared the meal. They didn't do that. They weren't allowed to study Torah. They had other important things to do, like raise children. But that was not Christianity. Christianity did teach. As much as people were able to be educated, it did encourage education of both men and women. It didn't send them off to school the way we do today. It didn't, steer them towards professions and doing everything men do by any means. Nevertheless, it did treat them with a great deal of dignity there. And that's part of Christianity, is that there is a sense in which, yes, in Christ, there is none of this great extreme difference between male and female. The promise is there for us all, and it's not contingent upon being a man or being a woman or being married or being unmarried. The promise of salvation is there, just as it is for both Jews and Greeks and slave and free. And there's quite a lot, and I think you really only have to read the homilies of St. John Chrysostom. You get a very decent understanding of these things. Yes, he has certain different assumptions than many modern people about the respect that women owe their husbands and the obedience that they owe them. The word translated as respect so often when in Ephesians 5, the word is actually fear. But it's not a fear in the sense of fearing to be beaten because you're not doing what you're told to do. It's a fear of disrespecting your husband and simply treating those over you with respect, giving them the honor that they deserve. So that is a part of ancient culture, very oftentimes much less humane than Christian culture. But it's, of course, very different from modern culture now, which just wants to ignore all of that altogether, and make no distinction between men and women. And that's what's gotten us into the mess we're in today, is that it's feminists who really started saying that male and female doesn't matter. Male and female is not important. Women can do anything they want to do. They can act like men. They can dress like men. They can take the jobs of men. They can be Marines. They can be firefighters. None of this makes any sense. And a lot of it is only excused by being very dishonest about what the consequences are of this ignorance, this enforced ignorance of this difference of male and female. But they started this whole idea that's gotten us to this point of transgenderism, where it's like, well, male and female doesn't really mean anything, and you can be whatever you want to be. And there is nothing that we're obliged to be because we're born male or born female. Whereas the Christian tradition is quite plainly, it's right there, first chapter, Genesis, in the image of God made he him, male and female made he them. Now, the fathers were reluctant to draw, in a sense, make a connection between those points, because in their day and age, they were fearful of sexualizing the deity. The way the Greeks, many other pagan cults, did indeed tell stories of their gods having sexual relations, and that's not Christianity, of course. So the fathers were oftentimes reluctant, or didn't want to get into explaining the connection between those two parts of that verse there. And sometimes they would simply say, oh, there's no connection. It's just saying two different things about it. But there is a way you can understand as being connected. And later on, St. Paul does actually draw analogies between the man and the woman and the father and the son. That's 1 Corinthians 11 again, where he says the head of the woman is the man, and every man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. And then he goes on to what he's talking about there. And this whole idea of headship, unfortunately, now we think in terms of the guy in charge, that's the head. Well, that's not how the Greek word was used in the first century. If you look at the little Scott Jones, big Greek lexicon of classical Greek, you won't find a single definition of the word kephale for head, meaning the guy in charge. The Greeks had half a dozen other words for that. They had kyrios, they had despotes, they had hegemon, they had archon, probably some I haven't even mentioned. All these meaning somebody in charge, but not kephale. Kephale, they did actually often use to mean the source of something. And we have that in English too, kephale meaning head, not head meaning source. We have at least two words in English where we make that connection there. The term headwater for the source of a river, and also the term fountainhead for a spring that is the headwater of a stream or river there. Well, that's generally how the ancient Greeks thought of the word kephale, thought of being ahead of something. And so the reference is to, and in fact, in the Septuagint, there's a verse that actually uses a kephale for head to translate Rosh, as in Rosh Hashanah, which means the head of the new year, the beginning of the new year. And it also uses the word arche as a synonym for kephale, and arche means beginning. It does give us several words like archon, which mean the ruling power, but the basic idea is the source of something. That's what begins things and whatnot. So that connection is really very deeply meaningful. That's the connection that St. Paul is talking about there between the Father and the Son and the man and the woman. The woman is created from the man, and the Son is begotten by the Father. And the man is created in the image of the Son. The Son is, as the Father is the arche of the Son, so the Son is the arche of creation. He's also the head of the church. St. Paul says that there.
It's apparent that none of this has to do with power or authority. It has to do with order.
Well, relation has natural relation. And not once in 1 Corinthians 11 does he mention the subjection of the woman or the fall. There's one, he does say something about on account of the angels, and some fathers interpret that to be a reference to the fall and the consequences of the fall, but nothing clearly points to a fault or the subjection. That's not what he's talking about there. He's talking about this source relation. And actually, Theodore of Cyrus uses 1 Corinthians 11:3, that whole idea of the man being head of the woman and God being head of Christ. He uses it to argue for the equal divinity of the Son. He is equal, he is God, because the Father is his source. He comes from the Father, he's begotten by the Father, and that makes them equal. And the same thing, the man being the head of the woman makes them equal. It gives them a common nature, common human nature. And so it doesn't really speak to subjection at all. Subjection is only added in order to maintain this original relationship of what I call the self-giving by the source, and then the thanksgiving by the person from the source. If you look at we have these, as I say, St. Paul draws this analogy, the man and the woman to the Father and the Son in 1 Corinthians 11, and then in Ephesians 5 he also draws an analogy between the man and the woman, husbands and wives, and Christ and the church there. And there he basically says that husband is to give his life for his wife, as Christ gave his life for the church. And how does the church respond? Well, the church responds with thanksgiving towards Christ. That's our main worship. The highest form of worship we have is this giving of thanks. And the woman would respond with a thankful service for her husband. That's what she's supposed to. That's what she owes her husband. And it just so happens that, well, since St. Paul has already drawn this analogy to the Father and the Son, if you look at the Gospels, if you look at all what it says about the Father and the Son, and how they relate to each other, and who does the giving and who does the thanking, all the giving is done by the Father, and all the thanking is done by the Son. Not once as it says that the Father thanks the Son, and not once as it says the Son gives anything to the Father except thanks. And this defines the relationship, I think, better than anything else. And you see that then, you see the image of that then in this relationship also of husbands and wives, of the self-giving of the husband and the thankful service that the woman, the wife owes to her husband for all that she does. Now she turns around. Now, of course, in that case, the man's doing the sort of taking the father's archic role, and the woman's taking Christ's thanksgiving role. But between the mother and the children, the woman assumes the archic role. She does the self-giving, and the children then respond with thankful service in helping her as they grow up. And so we all have these opportunities to, in a sense, act as the Father, in a sense, to others, and then also act as the Son does to the Father, being both the source of good things for other people, and then also the thankful recipient of good things for other people. And this is a fundamental way of relating that is really distinctive of Christianity. No other Godhead is presented in this way. And it's so deeply, I think, meaningful in terms of human relations in general. You see it plainly, the analogy drawn, the connection drawn between relations within the Trinity and the man and the woman there in Genesis, and then also in 1 Corinthians and in Ephesians. I think also when our Lord prays to the Father before his crucifixion, he says, that they may be one even as we are one. Well, the Father and the Son are one through this relationship of self-giving and thanksgiving. And so that's indeed the way that we become one too, both men and women, but also families, but also, the church, because really this is what sets Christian clergy apart from the laity, is that the clergy takes on this self-giving role of really dedicating their lives to the care of the flock. What is the good shepherd? Christ is the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. And that's what a clergyman does. That's what a parish priest does. He lives for the care of his sheep, his flock. And that's a broader responsibility than any layman takes on. No layman really accepts that. We have individuals that we may be responsible for, if we have a family, if we have a business or whatnot. But the clergy accept this lifelong commitment to caring for the flock. And so they take the archic role there. Deacons to a lesser degree than priests. Priests, I'm amazed, especially at our roll call priests. I'm just amazed at how much of their lives they give. Even if they're married, even if they have other jobs, they spend so much time in church caring for souls. And it really is quite amazing. Deacons to a lesser degree, but nevertheless, we do have that responsibility, lifelong responsibility, to give our lives, dedicate our lives to caring for the flock. And that's not something that laymen have taken on. They have other responsibilities, other times when they would take that archic role and give of themselves for their family or the people who work for them. Or if they're in any kind of executive capacity in the government, the ideal of Christian rule or kingship would be just that. It would be of a civil ruler who cared for his flock the way a father would care for them. And of course, the obedience that we would owe, the respect that we would owe someone who does that would be analogous to the respect of one of her husband. So they would take a Christ-like role.
Let's talk a little bit about the movement in fledgling, although growing, that exists. Maybe we just describe what exists today to those who are totally unaware of what's happening. I don't know how to judge it or gauge it, how big or how strong. I'll let you assess it. This idea of bringing back the role of deaconesses today, it strikes me, after all the hearing everything you said, it strikes me as definitely a fruit of this age, from what we can see, because the disintegration of the roles, which goes back deep in the Western, I would say, goes way back in the Western world. We have disintegration of ecclesiology, and we have a disintegration of other ideals. And so now we have the fruit of all that coming today, and feminism, as you described it. And in this context now, we have suddenly this movement to bring back deaconesses, and it seems to be characterized by principles and ideas that are of this age, and not something that's been coming down to us for 2,000 years and just an extension of what we've already lived. Right. So maybe you can just give us an introduction to what's being presented, as objective as possible, and then we can start to analyze it with respect to the holy tradition that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I have another book called 8 Ways to Run the Country, and I do go back into the intellectual history of the West on this issue. It's very much related to what I've said about male and female, but the modern age in the West has been an age of rebellion against the whole idea of owing something to somebody else. It's easy to see the rebellion in the Reformation, although it does have predecessors to that there. It actually comes out of the contention between feudalism and papalism in the West. They really sort of contend against each other. And so rationales are developed against papalism that lead to the Reformation. And then once they've rebelled against the church hierarchy, they then take aim at the civil hierarchy, and they rebel against monarchy. And then in our own day, it comes down to the social hierarchy or social order of rebellion against patriarchy, against men, against fathers. And this is the West. This is the West's general way of thinking. It's what the modern West is all about. You see it plainly expressed in Rousseau in the 18th century. He has this ethic of grievance He begins his great work on the social compact by saying, "Man was born free, but is everywhere in chains. And what is enslaved man is civilization. We've all become civilized, and we're subject to laws, and there's private property and all this." And he wants to throw all that off. And this is, of course, very appealing to a lot of people in that day and age. But it ultimately leads to Marxism as well, where you sort of all Marx really does is add a sort of class angle to this, a group angle, to where it's not just civilization, it's certain groups, certain classes who are to blame for oppressing other classes there. And that, of course, is a precursor for what we have now, the whole identity politics, the wokeism, where it's all a matter of blaming somebody else for why you're not entirely happy with your life there. An ethic of grievance, which is fundamentally satanic, really. This is what Satan does in the garden. He turns the woman away from the man. She turns her back on her source. And then the man turns back on his source to follow the woman. And of course, everything's meant, God, of course, takes action to turn things back around. But this is the fundamental, this is the way that Satan looks at the world, is this resentment for the life we've been given to live by the people to whom we owe our being. And that's what feminism is really all about. I don't know, there's almost no way that you can just defeat this. What we'll plainly see is a divide, we're already seeing that, a divide between people who are Orthodox and really care about the truth and see what the world is doing to the church. But then you have this other side that is just following the world. Their apostles are not Peter and Paul, they're Marx and Rousseau. They're taking their cue from these people who believe that submission is bad, subjection is bad, that subjection equals tyranny, that's all equals inequality. There's a great impatience to having to endure the rule of any other person, to having accept limits to one's being and not be allowed to do whatever you want to be. This is what they're all about, and they're extremely dishonest about it.
Is it the source of this within the church among Orthodox Christians and the clergy even, is the source of this siding with and expressing this the fruit of so much apostasy in the West and not understanding the Orthodox tradition? What is the source of it? That's what troubles me. Have we failed our own people to communicate everything that you just said and so much more? And therefore, they're looking at the Orthodox Church as if we are part and parcel with all that which has come to pass in the West with papal and Reformed Protestantism, and of the dissolution, which has brought us to what to quote a popular documentary, we don't even know what a woman is anymore. So we think that somehow the Orthodox Church has a part in that dissolution. Orthodox Christians seem to think that. And now we have to change the Orthodox Church to. So how did that happen? I mean, ultimately, something. This is at our feet, the feet of the clergy and the hierarchy and the teachers of the faith. That these people have put us in the same category with the various heterodox distortions.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's unfortunately it. There are a lot of people who would accept what the church teaches if someone taught it to them. But no one is, or very few are. When they tell the story of Adam and Eve, they'll leave out the part about the subjection of the woman. They'll only mention the pain in childbirth and what. They just never tell people that this is the way it is. They assume that, well, we live differently now, and women are going to do everything men do. And they don't even ask questions about, well, how differently could we raise our kids? We spend a lot of time now just basically pushing our girls to just be like men, go for careers, invest heavily in training for those careers. Wouldn't it be great if you'd have a family, but, not a lot of money is spent on preparing them for that. It's all about just having women do everything they want to do. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the, in a sense, a lot of pastors, a lot of men have simply not spoken up when they should have. They've taken Adam's role. They've just followed the woman. They're afraid of women. They're afraid of offending the women. And they don't know how to talk about this difference of male and female in a way that doesn't offend women. And that's what I hope to offer. All that I've said, and I know I've talked for a while about this relationship of self-giving and thanksgiving, but that's a way to explain the difference of male and female that doesn't make it sound like women are just inferior to men and just subject to men. Because no, ultimately it's not about subjection, and it's certainly not about inferiority. It's about this godlike relationship that men and women have, that parents and children have, and all human beings actually share, because we are created in the image of God. It gives pastors and men generally a way to talk about this difference of male and female that doesn't always simply demand submission, because ultimately the reason for not having women as priests or deacons is not submission. It's this natural relationship of self-giving by the man and thanksgiving by the woman in imitation of the Father and the Son. That's really the basis of it. So there's an argument for not ordaining women that has nothing to do with the subjection of the woman. So, and unfortunately, we haven't had that. Even as well-meaning as we are, we haven't been able to approach these things in that way. We have, unfortunately, had the subjection part quite too plain. And for a long time, we're very accepting of that, and it wasn't a problem. But now it's become a problem. And yet we've shied away from teaching that, and also shied away from delving into it, because it's a difficult issue. And it does mean that, well, you do have to look at the fathers, and you have to realize that some of them say different things, that indeed there's this emphasis of Origenism that is expressed in very few fathers, but nevertheless some big names have say some very troubling things there. And my dissertation, of course, takes issue with that. Hopefully that's something we can just set aside and realize, okay, that's just that, they're arguing from Greek presuppositions there, and they're not getting really a better understanding of things. But with a better understanding of things, a way of talking about male and female that isn't all about subjection, I think we can make the understanding of the difference of male and female, of the honor, the glory of being a man or being a woman, and the true equality in the sense of both being fully in the image of God, both taking the role of the Father in some parts of their lives, and then the role of the Son in other parts of their lives, through the self-giving and the thanksgiving. That is a way to talk about it, and that's what parish priests haven't had. And it'll take a while to sort of come to a way where people can feel more comfortable talking about these things, and then can be bold about it. Because
in my experience in the old country, these things weren't talked about because they were lived, and they were not challenged, but they were not thoroughly understood either. They couldn't be defended very well. Like when I was in the village there for 12 years up in the mountains outside Thessaloniki, I saw the older generation, how they lived, and no one questioned, but no one had any issue, because it was not driven by power over or power plays. It was happily accepted that the roles, and it worked very well. And I mean, just give you some practical examples that I saw, in the parish life and in the community. Women and men standing on the right and the left in the church. Women and men separately at the table afterwards, and they gravitated toward that. It didn't have nobody really even talked about it or questioned it. It was delightful. It was delightful for them. They weren't. So they were more or less relatives one to another, distant relatives in a village of 1,000 people. They were all somehow related to somebody, but so that I can't help but think that today's advocates for the return of deaconesses, it's how much of it, let me ask that, how much of it is really driven by a sense of being unjustly treated, not having authority or power, being neglected, and how much of that is legitimate, and how much of that is just the total neglect of the proper role of the man and the priest and the bishop, and teaching what the roles and living out the roles. And so you have this vacuum, and it gets filled in with all these heterodox ideas. And then the same thing that happens in the West is happening now among Orthodox. But traditionally, it was not an issue. It was never an issue 50 years ago and still is not an issue in most of Greece, in my experience.
No. Now, when all these anarchical movements there, they all begin with certain people who are just really dissatisfied with themselves and unstable as a result. And they seize upon this as this grievance as being an explanation for what's wrong with their lives. And so you get the real leaders really have a problem. They are people who have been taught wrong ideas and have seized upon them for their own personal reasons. A lot of times, they feel like they have to do what men do to prove themselves, and sometimes it's a matter of proving themselves to their father there, because sometimes that's the case. You know, they didn't grow up emulating their mother. They didn't see their mother as maybe receiving the respect she deserved. Everything of worth was what the man was doing, and to win their father's esteem, they have to do what he does. And so motherhood is not important to them. Instead, it's a career and everything else. But they've been taught some fundamentally wrong ideas too, philosophically, about the way that people should relate, and that of course gives them that angle of being able to then be motivated to make it a cause that they're going to pursue. A lot of other people, most women, even those who are generally feminist in their thinking, aren't like that. They're much stabler psychologically. And they really could just benefit from having things explained to them a better way. And like a lot of mysteries, you know, we really shouldn't search for answers to mysteries until we need the answers, because of course it's difficult. But now we do need the answers. We do need to delve into this a little more. For so long, yes, it was all customary. We had a tradition about treating men and women the same. And that's the thing. When you have a tradition, you don't have to ask these questions, because you live a life together and you know what that life is, and you trust that it's good and that it satisfies what every person needs there, and everybody has their place in it. It's very comforting, actually. So when you have that, then you just maintain it, but it's been challenged. In our own day and age, it's been challenged. And so we have to give a better justification for it, a better explanation for this.
Well, I think those who are clamoring for deaconesses, and probably a very different kind of deaconess than we had in the ancient church.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, very different.
Oh, yeah.
But as we said in the document 5 years ago, and I'll quote it here. I think this was your pen. Adequate preparation education, they say, are needed, not of the women to be appointed deaconesses, but of the people who will be called upon to receive honor and respect the deaconess assigned. In other words, what's needed is a kind of re-education of the people in order to accept something which is not easily acceptable among Orthodox people, which is a sign that something's very off. But that seems to be the case. There's an active effort in social media and conferences and everything to prepare the Orthodox to accept something they haven't seen for 1,000 years.
Yeah. Carrie Frost is very plain about this in her book. She just says, no, the deaconesses of today aren't going to be like the deaconesses of years ago. They're going to be very different. She'll say, in fact, they can be very different bishop to bishop. No need for them all to be the same everywhere, which is very unusual, because that's not the case with bishops, priests, or deacons. You know, we have specified roles to fulfill that are set in canon, and it's pretty much the same everywhere. Very little.
What are the needs that they're going to have to fulfill today? Anything like the ancient needs?
No, they're not proposing. Well, they're proposing care of women, and a lot of times it's counseling for women who are the victims of domestic abuse. Because, well, you know, there's some benefit for talking to a woman maybe about certain things, and that's very reasonable.
For that to happen?
What? Say again?
Do they need to be a deaconess?
No, that's the thing. It's like these are all just excuses. They got long lists of good things to do in caring for women, but none of them require ordination. None of them require rank, authority. And that's what they really want. They want that.
Are they pushing for an actual laying on of hands in the divine liturgy?
Oh, they want ordination. Oh, she's quite plain. Yes, they should be ordained deaconesses. They're very, very, very insistent upon that.
Can they point to anything? Can they point to anything in the ancient church that happened along those lines?
Well, you see, they lean heavily on the use of the word keratonia for the making of clergy. And they just sort of glide over the fact that, but that's used interchangeably sometimes with kerathesia. And sometimes keratonia would be used of readers. Mostly Blusteries talks about the keratonia of readers, and subdeacons are
So let me just translate that. Hierotonia, and hierothesia. Right. So that would be ordination, and then hierothesia, which is very similar but slightly different.
Yeah. Also laying on the hands.
In terms of etymology, it would be. Yeah. I don't even know how. Would it be a different translation?
And there's also kathistimi, meaning to be installed. That's another appointed. Yeah, another word that's used, and they're used interchangeably a lot of times. And Robert F. Taft, the great late Byzantinologist, Roman Catholic Byzantinologist, remarks in one of his books that nothing was. What did he say? Nothing was more Byzantine than mixing up your terms, basically. That there's a lot of just throwing terms around without being very discreet about it, what they all mean, and that just wasn't the Byzantine way. And so these terms are used differently, but definitely they mean ordained. And of course, they're looking at the rite of ordination. There is a Byzantine rite of ordination for a deaconess, and it's similar in its basic structure to the ordination of a deacon. The content, however, the structure is similar, but the content, prayers, and exactly what you do is all different. The prayers for a deacon refer to a calling, God having called the man to serve. The prayers for deaconesses doesn't say a calling; it says the woman has offered herself to serve. Clearly, an indication that God really does want men to serve, and He'll take the offering of women if they want to do it. The woman doesn't kneel. She doesn't bow her head on the table, holy table, as deacons and priests do. She gets an orar, but it's just put around her neck and under her amaphorion. It's different. In her duties, it just talks about duties, taking care of your holy houses. It's not clear whether it's talking about parish work or monastery work. And this rite only appears in a handful, about a dozen Byzantine service books out of the 2,000 that we have in existence. So clearly it was not a rite that was often done, not a rite that was often practiced. If only a dozen out of 2,000 even had it in the book, then obviously it wasn't something a lot of bishops felt they needed. But that's what they look at, and they want ordained deaconesses. That's the term. They want them rank.
Looking at the Anglicans and saying we need to be more like contemporary Anglicans. Is there a little bit of that? Just total
temporary
contemporary desires for rights, etc.
Oh yeah, this is they're getting all their moral cues from the world, and the world expects men and women to be the same. And in Frost's book, the demands are quite extensive in terms of what they want women to be able to do. They want altar girls. They want women serving as catechists and homilists, and in other capacities. They even talk about coming up with special rites for the coming of age for women. Having women involved in all councils and synod meetings, because you have to have that female voice because you can't trust the men. She points the finger at the men over and over again. Her main complaint is that the church is ruled by women or ruled by men, and that she regards as simply a crime. She has 3 chapters there on the whole issue of ritual purity. It seems kind of really overkill when all you're talking about are some prayers that are said, and she completely ignores any possibility there actually being real meaning to these prayers. It's all just an offense against women that she would have to have prayers for after miscarrying or after childbirth and things like that. It's just a
total misunderstanding of the patristic understanding of purity in this context. It seems to me. I remember this. Yeah. I was at a conference in Volos probably 10 years ago, and I heard a talk given by an apologist for all of this, and it was calling for the end of the prayer of the allowing for women to commune during the menstrual cycle. That was basically the big and other things.
Right.
I don't want to get off topic into that one. That's kind of another topic entirely, but it's not totally unrelated. In other words, when you see them pushing for the changes across the board in many ways, in many aspects of the roles and understanding of roles and the anthropology. I mean, some of it's just throwing off the Orthodox understanding of women and men.
Oh, yeah. No, she just completely ignores everything the church says on the subject, except those handful of verses that make it seem more feminist than otherwise. In talking about, and definitely, of course, the biggest thing they want is ordained deaconesses. And on the issue of women as priests or bishops, the only thing she will do, she does mention two reasons why we don't have women as priests or deacons. And one of the reasons is that, well, we've never had them. She does admit that we've never had female priests or female bishops. And then the other reason is our reticence to change. Those are her words. The Orthodox are reticent to change, and therefore that's why we don't have priests or deacons. But she says we should have that conversation. That and you can bet you will if you start ordaining deaconesses.
There's definitely the methodology of incrementalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing, and this is what we also say in that statement published 6 years ago, is that you have to think generationally. You have to think about not just about the effect of what we're doing now, but the effect of what we're doing a generation from now. Because already the jurisdictions that are seriously threatened by this push for deaconesses, because in ROCOR it's not really something we expect to happen anytime soon. I don't know about Russia. I wouldn't be surprised if there are people in Russia who, following St. Elizabeth the New Martyr, who did sort of think deaconesses were a good idea 100 years ago. But here in ROCOR it's not such a threat. But among the Antiochians and in the OCA, these are churches that have been letting women read the epistle for decades, and making no distinction between men and women in any other way except altar service. And people have gotten accustomed to that. And they don't believe, they haven't been taught anything else. Well, they've been taught equality. They've been taught the normal American way of just having women do what they want and don't let men tell them no.
I want to say something to all of those who think they're whatever they might be, whether it be ROCOR or some other jurisdiction. I think there needs to be this sense of, get this idea of, it's not going to bother us, it's not going to affect us, it's not what's happening in the Greek Archdiocese or with this particular archbishop or whatever, is not, we don't have to worry about that because, now we even have a schism basically between the Russian Church and the Patriarchate. But this is extremely naive, first of all. But secondly, to me, it's not an Orthodox ecclesiology ultimately, because unless we're no longer the church. There's one church. Everyone co-suffers for the entire church. And what's happening in not just a jurisdiction in America, but what's happening in Constantinople or in Alexandria or in wherever, whether we like it or not, we're communicants with that today through all the means that exist. And all of that means we're also communicants of the garbage that's coming over.
Yeah.
And as you said very astutely, this is today maybe not going to affect us, but it's very naive to think in 30, if the world still exists in 30 years, that our children or our grandchildren are not going to be heavily influenced by and all kinds of cross-pollinization, all the rest. But we should co-suffer and be very concerned, no matter if it is our jurisdiction or our local church.
Right. Yeah.
From a spiritual standpoint, from a sense of being all members of the one body. This whole jurisdictional division is very superficial ultimately. I mean, if you're all communing of the same mysteries and we're all supposedly confessing the same faith, and now you have a introduction of heresy or delusion or perversion or distortion, absolutely we need to be immediately feel co-responsible for the protection of the faithful, no matter if they're in our parish or in our diocese or not.
Yeah.
I feel very strongly about that because I hear sometimes people like, well, I'm in ROCOR, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah,
I think it's very naive.
No, yeah. We're still in the same church, and we do care what happens to people in other churches.
Yes.
And I hate to say, I do think there will be that. Yes, the schism will grow and grow, and that the other side will go with deaconesses, and that's just probably inevitable. But in that case, there's going to be a real trial for many people in the middle having to decide which way to go. And that's where it's like we need to be involved. Even if our own jurisdiction is not threatened by it, nevertheless, our brothers and sisters are threatened by it.
There are prominent people in ROCOR who have embraced this. We have a particular nun who is very outspoken in ROCOR, and I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't know if she's ever been severely reprimanded for this. She was in Volos when I was at that conference, and she was clapping. So it's naive to think that these things aren't affecting people across the board, across the Orthodox Church.
That's true.
God forbid, and I think that's a sober analysis you just gave. God forbid that it happens, but it's possible, certainly. Not too far in the distance either, for things to continue to dissolve.
One benefit. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
I was just going to say is that there's a revolutionary saying attributed to Trotsky, or was it Lenin? The worse things get, the better things are. And from a revolutionary standpoint, that's the case. The worse things get, it's it disrupts things, and you can take advantage of it. But at least from our perspective, the worse things get, sometimes the clearer things are.
Yes.
You do get a clear idea as to, a clear choice of good and evil there. And sometimes that's what God gives us. Good man, bad man. Pick one. Jesus of Nazareth or Barabbas there. And that's what we're coming to on this issue, is that and I do believe that, through your efforts, through my efforts, the efforts of at least half a dozen other people I know, that we can present the faithful with a better understanding of this.
Yes.
So that many more of the faithful will see the light and will not be taken in. And it may not stop, the ones who really with the world and what they want to have, but it's still going to save an awful lot of people for the church of different jurisdictions. And it is uncertain as to where those jurisdictions are going to fall out on these things.
And even outside of Orthodoxy, I would say there's a tremendous opportunity. Every time the truth is spoken on any aspect of the life of the church, there's people out there who are listening, and it's an occasion for them to embrace the entire truth, to embrace the person of Christ. So the struggle for the truth in the realm of ideas is intimately linked to the communion of people with the person of truth, the Christ himself. They're not, you can't separate them. And so the more the Orthodox witness to the truth in whatever realm that it's being, challenged, the more you're going to see people come into the faith.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was seeing that personally, actually. This business about the clearer things are, I think of that in terms of what we've seen in terms of people coming to the church and wanting to become Orthodox. I teach catechism regularly at the cathedral, St. John the Baptist here in DC. And I've been doing it for years, 5 years or so. And I have 2 or 3 classes a year, actually 3 or 4. But they get larger and larger. I now have the second class with over 10 people in it. And this one's a little different because half of them are Ethiopians, and then there's a Somali convert from Islam to Christianity. Now he wants to be Orthodox, and these are people who. And there was a fellow from El Salvador, a young woman from Pakistan, another convert from Islam. But they've read online, they listen, they've seen you online, or they've seen Jay Dyer, or they've seen somebody out there offering better explanations of things, and they're coming out of the woodwork. We're not advertising, but they're coming to us, and they're going to these classes, and they're just eating it all up, and just me explaining the church to them.
I don't think we've ever seen, in my experience of 30 years of Orthodoxy, we've ever seen this kind of increase in catechumens across the board, across the United States. Right? It's unprecedented since COVID and the end of COVID. I mean, Father Josiah, our friend down in Los Angeles, he's over 100 and something catechumens in his parish right now.
Really? Yeah.
So all of this is connected to the truth of things. And a lot of those people who are coming in zealous to learn the faith, if we can rise to the occasion and give them the patristic mind and get out of the way, that's what I tell people, look, I'm just a donkey. You need to be connected to the fathers, the saints of our day. And if that happens more and more, then in a way, I think the Lord will even overturn this internal dissolution possibly that's happening. And that's the hope, is that the base will become, because we have in our day, and I'm getting off topic here, and I want to open it up to questions now because we're already an hour and 24 minutes in. But just to close it out, and you can give some closing thoughts before we go to questions. But we're what's unprecedented in our day, it seems to me, is we've always had heresy. We've always had distortions, perversions from Islam coming in, and various iconoclasm or papism on the papal Protestants. But today we have a undermining of the base through secularization, through an abandonment of proper catechism and initiation, and so we have from above and below, as it were, a crushing on the faithful, and making it very hard for them to properly be initiated. The mystagogues are not doing what they need to be doing to be initiating the people into the life of Christ and protecting them from the various heresies. And so that secularization from the bottom is what really complicates things today in our struggle to present and teach Orthodox.
Yeah. Well, it may be more of a threat to some of the homegrown, because clearly people are coming to us acting against the secularization.
Yes.
They do need to be brought in thoroughly. And I do a bit of that in my early classes, in sort of, not just starting with what we teach, but starting, first of all, explaining some wrong things about the world, about sinners and the way sinners have behaved in the last several centuries and whatnot, to get them then to the gospel story, in a sense, the way God brings us, works for our salvation there. Because that's something that they need to get that before it becomes problematic for them later on. So
wonderful. Let's open it up to questions. There's tons of them, and we appreciate so much your time today. I think it was very, very good, and we can touch on in the questions. I'm sure more will come out. We'll touch on other aspects maybe we didn't touch on enough. So first question that I see here. First of all, let me just thank. We've got new members on our YouTube channel, Dark Lord in a tutu, whatever that name is, Valley, and others. Thank you much. Glad to have you. This is from Jessica. I have a question if Father Peter has time. How or should we take teaching on church-related topics from lay people, women and men, assuming they are Orthodox, academically qualified? You're happy to jump on this as well, Father Patrick. I mean, I guess the question is, should we listen to laymen, women or men, teaching the faith? That seems to be the question, right? Am I misreading it? What do you think?
Well, we all have a responsibility to teach the faith in a way. Although, of course, there is a reason why we have clergy and expect clergy to be trained a bit better about these things. I know there is a problem where just a lot of people who are just recent converts are out there online, and they're carrying on arguments with people about various things and whatnot. And I know there's some concern about that, that indeed some people, recent converts, need to be careful. And I have to say I was guilty of this myself. Coming into the church, and of course, you do a lot of reading that people who've grown up Orthodox haven't done. You get some ideas. You can be too bold as a recent convert and holding forth on the way you think things ought to be. And it's always a good idea if, of course, you avoid that for a while and allow yourself time to mature before you get into that. But I wouldn't say that plainly this is something that only clergy should do, because we're all called at times to bear witness. There is a priesthood of all believers. That's our job in the world. And so we're all called to bear witness to the truth, to share the truth, to teach it to others. That's the benefit of our fellowship hour afterwards, and all the other things we do for fellowship to bring the young people, newer people to the church, get them to know people already in the church, because there's so much that they learn from that relationship there. So yes, there are abuses. Yes, there are people making too much of things, but no, it can't be left just to the clergy.
I would say that it's one thing to teach in an academic manner, in a historical, theological manner. That can definitely be beyond just the clergy. The bishops can appoint catechists, and there were definitely that existed. But it's another thing to be a mystagogue. And if you're talking about mystagogy, that's a priest's role, and that's initiation into the mystery of the spiritual life. Ultimately, that's got to be the role of the one who's already walked the path. But that doesn't seem like what you're talking about. You're talking about simply more of a general teaching about the truth of the faith, about aspects of the doctrine and teaching and all the rest. And that certainly can be done by those who aren't ordained, if blessed by the bishop and qualified and all the rest. Justin, someone was reading from the writings of St. John Chrysostom. Once he said that women are a necessary evil. I've never heard that personally. Have you?
No.
I don't think that's true.
Some Greek philosophers say that, but no Christian father.
No, I can't imagine that.
Except in joking, but I don't think
probably misinterpreted by somebody or rephrased. Why can Greek Orthodox not be cremated? A lot of people opt for cremation because the costs are 1/4, which for some of us is significant. Off topic, but we do accept off topic. A lot of questions are off topic here. So if you want to jump, I have an answer, but go for it. We'll keep them short answers, quick answers, so we've got a lot of questions.
It doesn't show respect for the body, and the body is a part of us. We are body and soul. There's a wrong belief I saw posted today with C.S. Lewis's name on it. Maybe he had this wrong belief that says that you're a soul with the body, and I know that's a common belief. That's also very Origen is. No, we're soul and body, and we always have a connection to the body, and we'll get this body back in the resurrection. There, so
there's not a cell in the body that doesn't have the soul in it. I mean, there's nothing. You cannot like say, oh, the soul ends somewhere in the body. It's the life of the body is So the other thing would be, this is a simple thing, but this is really core to orthodoxy. Where do we have an example of that? You got any saints who did that? You have the Lord himself, the Mother of God. I mean, it's unconscionable. It's unimaginable to think of any of the holy ones being burned alive or burned after death and cremated. So it's not even a question for the Orthodox. We follow the examples and the lives of the Holy Fathers. And that's the same answer that I gave on this question of deaconesses. They say, they act like this is not a real substantial argument. I think Bishop Carlistos Ware, in his discussion of this years ago, kind of said, well, that's not a strong argument. I think I remember him saying, I don't want to misquote Bishop Carlistos, but somebody serious was saying, well, just because we've never done it doesn't mean we can't. No, actually, that's not true. I don't think that's accurate. That's not how the Orthodox approach these things. The fact that we've never done it is a big argument against it, right? Because why haven't we done it before? Women priests, I think he was talking about women priests, not deaconesses, but women priests. And the same thing here with cremation. It is what the strongest argument that none of our saints, none of our fathers, none of our, not only didn't teach it, but they didn't do it. So why would we imagine it as something that we should start doing? I think it's, just not it's unimaginable for Orthodox. Besides all of the theology of the body, besides the fact that it wouldn't be honoring the body and all the rest. Okay, here we are. I don't have a problem with beautiful young women performing duties as essentially maids in the church with a small tonsure ordination. Just my personal opinion. Okay, well, it doesn't matter what our personal opinions are much, and maids in the church. I don't know what
I know that this fellow, that question doesn't really seem too straightforward. It may be more provocative than anything else.
Yeah. Dave Davis, I read somewhere that female deacons were women who were beyond childbearing years and were widowed. I'm looking for a book where I read that.
Well, you should read my book. The Disappearing Deaconess here. It'll explain all of that in there. It's just 100 pages, but it's a lot of footnotes, a lot of detail. I mean, the lowest age for a deaconess was 40. It at times was as high as 60. At 50, that would pretty much ensure that someone had already passed menopause. But you certainly had to be without children and not married, a widow or someone whose husband had become a bishop. You couldn't be burdened with family. That was an assumption that no, you couldn't serve the church in that way because you have this other responsibility of caring for a family.
I was told by
your husband too. You couldn't do that.
I was told by an Athonite abbot I was talking to this about years ago that 40 back then was considered very old comparatively. So I mean, you were married by 20, and by 40, most women had finished their childbearing. So not like today, where people aren't even married until their 30s. So you have to put that in perspective of back in the day. 40 was quite old, and the life expectancy I think was less than it is today.
Yeah, and the advocates of deaconesses today don't have any of those limits in mind. No, they like the idea of mataskas, priest wives, also being deaconesses, and just any young woman, really, like any young man could be a deaconess.
As someone says in the comments, priest wives are already basically deaconesses. I mean, in some ways, they already
do a lot of service there, but you don't want to create them, give them rank. Oh, that would wreck a lot of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's more like for the rank they want it, not for this need being
they
met.
don't need the rank. They get enough honor anyway as Montesquieu and presbyteros.
I think it would be lovely to have deaconesses, considering what wonderful women they would be to be able to emulate. I had no idea. What is the downside to it if the basic form was followed? I guess if the basic form, meaning the old accepted form, was followed, what would be the downside? Is that what she's asking?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe she's thinking, what if we had deaconesses, pious deaconesses, like they did centuries and centuries ago. But of course, all those deaconesses lived within the limits that were specified by the church, by St. Paul, all those apostolic limits on what women can do. And they actually practiced modesty, which is not just in dress, but also in speech. Silence was considered, the reserved talk, not always talking. That was considered quite appropriate especially appropriate for nuns, but appropriate for all women there. So if there were any deaconesses who were saints, and there were, but they lived within those limits. They were not feminists. No, we don't have that as an example of deaconesses. But that's not the people who are demanding to be deaconesses now. They're not like that at all. They have what they want, and they're very vocal about it, and very vicious sometimes in dealing with other people who are against them.
Yeah, I think that basically a deaconess would be like in a monastic today. We would see it in a similar, comparatively to what. Our priests seem very overworked these days. Deacons are in short supply. Maybe this would be extra hands for the priest of the parish. I think he means deaconesses would be extra hands for the priest of the parish. Again, a little naive about what's actually going on around us right now.
Yeah.
Why does? Go ahead if you want to say anything. Jump in.
No, I was just going to say, it's like, it's not like giving woman rank is going to solve any problem there. You just need to recruit a man to be a deacon if you don't have one. Encourage more men to be deacons. Encourage more men to take the other roles, subdeacons and readers. Get more men involved, because that's really the health of a parish. Is when you have commitment, buy-in by men, then you've got a full community. But resorting to women, well, the churches that really go after the women are the ones that are dying, and the ones relying still upon male leadership are the ones that are bringing them in out of the woodwork and still growing. So.
Why does AFR continue going back to this topic? I don't know. We have to ask AFR.
Well, they're under a lot of pressure, I'm sure, from that side. That side is lobbying. They were aghast. People complained about me being interviewed by AFR, and I was not included on this upcoming big debate, or they're calling it a documentary. I don't know how you can have a documentary, which is basically a dozen people offering their opinions. But clearly, feminists wouldn't want to deal with me. They wouldn't agree to appear with me, because I won't give them more respect than they deserve. I will speak the truth, and they know that, and they are afraid of what I'll say. They're not afraid of what other people will say, because other people will give them more respect than they deserve, and make not necessarily the best arguments against it.
So I'm gonna put on the screen here what I think is. Let me just get it ready here in a second. This is from Ancient Faith. This is what's happening. I guess on the 30th. Let me just share it with everybody so they're aware. This is. You see that there? January 30th, the first episode of the 2024 Ancient Faith Today documentary series. John Maddox and Father Tom Soroka take a deep dive into this topic, and with the Orthodox Deaconess examining the call for restoration. The story of the Orthodox Deaconess is largely unknown today. When did they exist? What was their function? In recent decades, there's been a call for restoration of the female diaconate, and it's causing no small debate. The full audio documentary will feature scholarly experts on both sides of the issue. Do you think that's accurate? Are going to be both sides represented here from what you can see on the
No, these are people that they feel that the other side feels safe with, plainly, and there are reasons for that. None of these people have written a book about deaconesses, well, except for, of course, the feminists, the Valerie Karras and Helen Frederick Frost. I mean, they're very active in it. They know their arguments, but the others, the people on the other side, they've commented on the subject, but they haven't written at length on deaconesses, and the other side will feel safe with them. And that's it. So they'll let them have their say. Sometimes you look at that first name up there, Metropolitan Sava. Well, sometimes leaders of organizations like that, they need one thing. They need to hear two things. They need to have an excuse for doing the right thing, in addition to a way of also placating the people who aren't going to get what they want. And the hope is that some of the people speaking more sensibly on this panel will provide hierarchs with a way to deal with the issue that doesn't just quietly infuriate the side that may not get what they want. And that's something that, that may come. That's some good that may come from this. And so there may be voices there. There are some good people on this panel, and they may be able to offer a way of speaking about it to the hierarchy that can get the hierarchy, in a sense, off the hook, allowing them to not go forward with having deaconesses without completely causing a greater schism within the church by being too emphatic about it.
Well, I guess my question would be for any hierarch today. I mean, how sizable and how serious is the group that's pushing for deaconesses? Is it just a minority with a very strong voice and media and institutions, or do we actually have a groundswell of faithful and priests and needs that need to be met? Because is it really do we have these massive needs in our parishes right now that we need to meet? It doesn't seem like it, but that's the claim, right? That's the claim they're making.
There are a lot of people who do assume that, of course, this should be done, but they're not out there lobbying for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just assume it. They want to see it for whatever reason that they're personally, but they're not meeting a need. Like a hierarch has. I would assume a hierarch wants to fill the needs he has so many needs today, right? So many needs that he's constantly being asked to meet. Why would he want to pile on more, fanciful needs, unless he's being politically pressured into it? He feels like he has to do it for the sake of his flock or something like this. But is that really the case? That doesn't seem to be.
No.
I think it's more fabricated. Anyway, we'll see what happens next week. Okay, there are 26,000 women in the National Philopticus. This is in the Greek Archdiocese, I guess. The job is to minister to widows, orphans, and poor and sick. What deaconesses did?
Right. Okay. So you don't need deaconesses if you have 20,000 women already doing that.
Why does that happen so often? Actually, the Greek means something entirely different to the word that's been used in English for centuries. Then why not update the English translation? I think we were talking about, what were we talking about earlier?
Deaconess? Oh, in terms of, maybe he's saying that, diakonos always means deacon, but it doesn't. That's just it.
Maria Petra says, isn't the priest's wife automatically a deaconess, his helpmate and assistant in the church? In our local parish, we call Father Oliver and Mother Laura. Oh, the Matushka, Mother Laura. Okay. So,
well, there are obviously things that, yes, I mean, there are services that people can do for the church, ministries in a sense. Protestants are common about calling anything they do about the church a ministry and whatnot. But yeah, there's plenty of work to be done, and people can offer themselves humbly to do that work. And that's a great thing. And really, and I write this actually in my book, St. Phoebe, in a sense, she was one of the one of these go-to people that if you needed something, you could go to her and she'd be a big help. It doesn't mean that she had some kind of formal ordination or rank or responsibilities or position or honors that went with it. And that's what the advocates want. They want women treated like deacons, ordained deaconesses. That's what they keep saying, ordained deaconesses, not they're disappointed with the deaconesses that were recently made in Africa because they weren't ordained. They only had prayer said over them. And that's what they're really after. It's that rank, it's that status, that authority. They want to elevate women in the hierarchy of the church. And problem with that is it does end up sort of putting them over laymen. So you've subverted the natural order. You've made men subject to women. And I know the world does that, and some churches do that. We don't think twice. They don't think twice about putting women in charge of men. But that's not really the best way to live. And certainly when it comes to establishing the order within the church, there we should concentrate on the best way to live. And that's pretty well specified in the tradition.
And is that really what's been handed down to us? Do we have that teaching and that example for 2,000 years? No. We don't. That would be an innovation on our part, right? Not only would it be not a good idea, but it would be a departure from what we've been doing for 2,000 years. Can you discuss how this is affecting the Greek Church in America, that deaconesses is being pushed, especially as a liturgical role? I don't have a lot of knowledge of it because I'm not really. Maybe you do. I don't know.
No, I don't have any direct knowledge of what's going on in the Greek Archdiocese. I know people are indeed lobbying for it, and I've heard actually from people on the other side. It's been proposed. Of course, they also want altar girls as well, and at least the advocates of it are right now sort of putting together a program. I think they realize they've got to be a little more specific about what they're asking for, and so they're trying to map out exactly what they want deaconesses to do as a prerequisite for anybody to sort of bite on it and go there.
It's outrageous what they ask for. Who is supposed to take care of the children and babies while she serves in the altar, or if she's pregnant, or if she needs to be breastfeed? It's ridiculous. This is from a woman, Elena. Is that
Yeah. Who in a sense is more, as a human being, more godlike than a mother with these little children? I mean, you're everything to them, and it's a wonderful thing. And to think that, well, you can just put them aside and go do something else, it just makes no sense.
It just reminds us of feminism and the desire to go in the workforce and all the rest, doesn't it?
Yeah. And of course, a lot of cases we're talking about women who are older or women who are not married and don't have kids and any intention of it. And there is a connection, of course, between the real sexual radicals and the ones pushing for deaconesses. A lot of overlap there between the ones who are, they're not just for deaconesses, they're for gay marriage and all the rest of it. There's some of the same people. They just completely woke on this whole idea of male and female. That's a problem.
Yeah, it's usually a package deal because the presuppositions and the whole outlook is engaged in that direction. How can we properly express our absolute rejection of ideas like this? Person, Carrie, what's her last name? Frost.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, Carrie Frost.
Appropriately to the church leadership. So Mrs. Anna is asking us, what do we do, and if we don't like this development?
You can always write your bishop and just respectfully venture your opinion, offer your opinion, and hope that he does the right thing, and pray for him. And of course, you can always also talk to others in the parish. Read my book's a good place to start in terms of just knowing the issues and not being then buffaloed by claims made by the other side.
You can get that. You can get your book on Amazon. Anywhere else?
Amazon. It's available elsewhere, but Amazon's probably the easiest way to do it.
Easiest for everybody.
It has, by the way, the statement. It's included in the book is the statement that we published 6 years ago on this, which is still a very good text to use. There's also a short talk that I gave to the St. Phoebe Center back in 2017. They did invite me to one of their conferences then, and I gave a little, very brief but very well received, actually, considering the audience talk on the issue, and that's also included in the book, which does sort of frame the issues, I think, rather well. And I also talk about Saint Phoebe, and how, and indeed, you can see how, yeah, she was a very meaningful, very helpful to the church, and may have had some sort of recognition in terms of being some kind of formal deaconess, but that doesn't mean that she was what I am today, because no, the women couldn't do what I do today, not in the ancient church.
Father Peter and Protodeacon Patrick, what is it we should do? How do we honor obedience as well as stand against such a subtle demonic attack such as this?
Well, I don't know that. I mean, who would consider that you're disobedient by standing up against this? Unless you've got a parish priest telling you to shut up, or a bishop. We can always speak the truth, and no harm in that, no disobedience in that.
Yeah, I think we have I talked about this often in the last couple of days. We've been talking about it with regard to some other developments, but the idea that obedience to those who innovate and depart from the deposit, the parakatathiki, the deposit that's been handed down, the faith and the ethos, that one must be obedient. Blind obedience doesn't exist in Orthodoxy.
No.
If we had blind obedience, we wouldn't have dozens and dozens of great saints of the church. So there is no such thing as blind obedience. There's obedience to Christ in and through the hierarchy and the priests insofar as they are obedient to Christ. Then everything is salvific. So there's no contradiction here. If someone is innovating and departing and you stand and say, no, that's not the holy tradition, that's part of your role. Every single Christian has co-responsible ultimately for the faith. When dogmatic matters are at stake, we all have to play a role, and that's proven many, many times throughout church history. Evil walks in small steps. This is Sabbath. If it were to come all at once, we would not be deceived. Saint Paisios.
That's a great quote. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
That is so true, and that's true in our own personal spiritual life. It's true in the larger context of the church and society.
Yeah.
Brother Augustine asks, Aristotle Papa Nicolau, or whatever the name is exactly, from Fordham, is not pushing for female altar service. People keep asking him whether he thinks women should be ordained as priests, and thus far he has refused to answer. I don't know, actually. I haven't paid attention to what Mr. Papa Nicolau is saying, but what do you...
If he's refused to answer, then he's declined the opportunity to speak the truth on the matter there. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he would really stand up against female priests.
Yeah, I would be surprised if he was against it.
Yeah.
How do we correct the heresies in our seminaries, both in, St. Vlad's and Holy Cross? DK. I think she's in the Greek Archdiocese. What to say?
Yeah.
What to say.
Again, you can always write letters and express your dissatisfaction to the heads of the seminaries. On this issue, the head of St. Vlad's is actually very right, actually, very sound, very good. He's on our side. He signed our statement from 6 years ago.
Father Chad Hatfield.
Yeah.
Father Chad and I came into Orthodoxy the same year, I think, he'd be a little bit earlier than me, maybe a year or so, but he was a former Anglican like I was. And he knows through bitter experience before Orthodoxy how it all works, the incrementalism outside of it.
He's been very encouraging to me over the years too. So.
Why are women unable to take the Eucharist on their period? Where does this come from? Are you well read? Do you want to answer that, or?
Well, I certainly Carrie has a chapter in her book, and I've read that. It's not an issue that I deal with greatly. You have to understand, for one thing, if you're bleeding, deacon or priest, you can't serve in the altar. If there's visible blood, we want to keep blood out of the altar. This is a bloodless sacrifice, and so you don't come near holy things when you're in that state. And of course, in the old days, until very recently, really, menstruation was actually a hygienic problem. It could be smelled, and it could be sometimes seen. I've seen accidents. I've been in church. Actually, a funeral was not an Orthodox church, but I've seen a young woman suddenly begin to menstruate, and there it was, and that's a concern. And I've had women tell me that they can tell when other women are menstruating by smell, and that, so there are practical reasons, and then also pious reasons why you might simply, feeling that you're not quite on your best physically, that you might withhold yourself from communion. There are ancient canons that say that. I don't know that many priests nowadays make an issue of it, but it's not something that you could just plainly say is wrong and just old thinking, because there is the practicality of it, and then there is the respect, pious respect for the sacrament itself, that would lead some pious women to think that maybe it's best if you stayed home. So.
I think what we're lacking today is deep piety, the kind of piety you see and the sensitivity you see in the saints like Saint Paisios.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they're coming from, and the church fathers are coming from. In other words, only the best, and only the best stance, the whole stance that we have, is affected by these very human and fallen, parts of our fallen world here that is in the providence of God, in the sense of God allowing for and working within for the continuation of the race and all the rest that He's allowed for in His great wisdom, which is blessed, but it's still of this world. And so if there's other instances where you could point to the church saying, in these states, for these reasons, people cannot commune, and it's not because they are intentionally sinning or sinful or unclean in the sense of sinning. The only thing that's unclean ultimately is sin. That's after with Christ. Everything else in the Old Testament was ritual uncleanness, which points to and is a pedagogue for the people of God in the Old Testament. So today, sin is the only thing that's unclean. But having said that, there are instances where the church says, okay, yeah, you come back from war, for instance, not directly related to the question of menstruation, but it's interesting, the church's wisdom. There's been a miscarriage. There's been in a dream, a man has lost semen, etc. There are a number of different places and ways the church says, no, this is not conducive or consistent with how we prepare and receive Holy Communion. Are they sinful in all these cases? No. People are blessed to go and defend the nation, and yet when they come back, they have a canon of not communing for I don't know how long. It depends on the priest, but there's canons that say no communion for men coming back from war. Not that they are considered to be, went there to kill people and to murder or something, but they're defending the nation. So I think we're very far from the stance of the saints when we look at it. We look at it very, very much in terms of in a legalistic way. That's what I see people doing, in a carnal way. I don't know. If you find that agreeable to you, but that's how I've come to understand it over the years. Yeah. Let's open it up. The next question: how do we abolish the presumption of this movement, which is based on writings alone, the Protestant approach? In other words, the whole argument is based on a non-Orthodox approach.
That's true.
How do we disassemble or abolish this presumption?
Yeah, I think if a lot of people read Gary Frost's book, they pretty much see, in a sense, what they want, and they'll see how they've treated the tradition, how she treats the tradition, ignoring so much of it. If you just read my review of it on my website, there's a brief review of it. It was published in the Rule of Faith Journal last year, and that saves you from having to read the book. But I do detail all the ways in which she ignores the tradition and complains about things. As I was telling Father Peter here earlier, it's sort of the Mein Kampf of Orthodox feminism. It tells you where they're really headed, all that they want, really, almost all that they want. She does pull the punch on there and not demanding female priests and bishops, but she doesn't give any reason why we shouldn't have female priests or bishops. None of them will. None of them actually ever make an argument for why we shouldn't have women as priests or bishops. They just say, well, we're not asking for that now, or we haven't had those, and therefore you shouldn't worry about that. But none of them will actually explain male and female in a way, or explain what it means to be a priest and a bishop in a way that really justifies the exclusion of women from those roles there. That's quite plain. It's quite plain in her book, and if you just read the review I wrote of it, then you'll have a brief little summary there. And if we could just share that, and it has been shared quite a bit, I think it's done some damage. I think she did her cause some harm in writing this book, because she did reveal too much about the way they're approaching this whole issue and what they really want. Because what they really want is quite a lot. It would be a very different church. It would be an Episcopalian church, basically, and look almost nothing like an Orthodox church that I'd want to go to. And it's all right there in the book. Yeah, we should just let people know this is what they're up to.
Mm-hmm. You're not so much a question, but a statement from Orthodox Protestants. To any bishops who may hear this stream, I wanted to say we love you, we pray for you, and want to be shepherded in truth. Please help us. Okay, thank you. Did women become feminists because men have failed to protect them, or did men no longer respect women because they have turned feminists?
I think women become feminists because they're raised in a world that basically teaches that's its own ethics are based upon freedom and equality and all those good revolutionary ideas that have been sold to the West, and it no longer believes the gospel, and no longer respects tradition, and so people have just grown up to be feminists. As just the way the culture is. The only ones that are militant feminists, those are people who have other issues they're dealing with personally, and that's why they're so motivated to be a feminist. Of course, they'd say the same thing as me. There are things in my life that made me sort of key in on this issue. I've been writing about gender issues for 40 years. I read a book in college that sort of made me think about things, and then I realized, oh, this is a real problem, and it's not something that a lot of people are writing about, and I ought to, and so I've been doing that ever since. Those are my own motivations. They likewise have motivations of their own. I at least have the comfort of saying that what I'm advocating is what the fathers have always said. They make such great sense on this issue. St. John Chrysostom, read what he says about men and women, husbands and wives. He's just so sensible about the whole thing. Make thy rule glorious, he says, speaking to husbands. Yes, you're the head, her head. Make thy rule glorious, and glorious it will be when she meets with no dishonor from you. That's what he says. I mean, that's good advice to husbands, and it comes right from St. John Chrysostom from 1,500 years ago.
I wonder if any of those promoting this have read St. John Chrysostom much.
Yeah, well, it's in much of what he says is in my books. Not everything. I quoted much more of him in the book I wrote years ago called The Scandal of Gender, but that's out of print. But a lot of it is, you'll find other gems that are worth quoting from him and my recent books.
Do you think that I'm of the conviction, and we're actually going to make a documentary about this called What is a Christian? We're starting next month filming What is a Christian? And I was inspired by this to make this documentary when watching What is a Woman by Matt Walsh. So I realized as I was watching it that there's a direct line between the loss of the understanding of what a Christian is, in other words, what the church is, who is Christ. These are all interrelated questions. The identity of Christ and us as Christians, is that loss directly led to what we today, the loss of what is a woman. And not just what is a woman like in terms of transgender, but what is a woman in terms of feminism, or all these questions that were this dissolution of our identity, women, men, Christians. But first we had to lose who Christ was, what the church was, what it means to be a Christian. that had to go before we could come to this terrible state that we're in today.
Yeah. If there is no God, then all things are permitted.
Yes.
I think it usually attributed to Dostoevsky, one of the characters in Brothers Karamazov. And that's it. In a sense, you give up belief in God, and then it's like, well, there is no right and wrong. We can demand anything we want, and that's it.
What are the theological metaphysical reasons the church does not ordain females?
Well, the main reason is there's an order, and that the man has been given responsibility for giving his life for the woman. And one way you do that is take that leadership in the home and in the church and in society as well. And so that's it. And then, of course, in order to keep the man and the woman together and to preserve human society, to have it survive, God did commit the woman to the charge of the man. That's right there in the scriptures. It's in the law. It's in the fathers. There's just no way around that. And so you have an order where the man is the head, and that means he's the source of the woman. But it also now, with the subjection, also means that he has a certain responsibility for her, and a certain position to actually lead and be in charge to some degree. And so those are the theological reasons. This difference. And it's not just a subjection, as I explained earlier. It's not just a subjection. It's actually the way we bear the image of God. There's a likeness between the man and the woman and the Father and the Son. St. Paul writes about that, 1 Corinthians 11. And it's a likeness in the way they relate to each other. And that likeness looks upon the man to take the role of the Father in the sense of being the one to be self-giving. And the woman takes on the Christic role, the role of the Son there, and being thanksgiving. And that's why the man has that responsibility in the church, and as I say, in the home as well.
So it would upend the order on the natural level between men and women. Would it also depart from Holy Tradition? We've never done this. It would also depart from the symbol and the iconic nature of.
Yeah. It would obscure the image of God and man.
Yes. And also that the priest is in the type and place of Christ. So now and that they might, I don't know if they just dismiss that. They think that, but if they dismiss that, there'd be nothing of malehood, manhood or womanhood.
When you speak of Christ, certainly as the good shepherd who giveth his life for his sheep, that's the man's role. And so, yes, that's why the man is a priest. But it's the woman in the relationship who actually takes the son's role, the Eucharistic son's role towards the man. So in that sense, she is being Christ-like by being the one to submit. And this is the thing, the scandal is, why should anyone have to submit to anybody else? The whole idea of subjection. But it's the Son who does the will of the Father. And is humbled. First, Philippians there, he takes on the semblance of a servant and becoming a human being, a man, and that's a Christ-like thing to do, to be that humble and to serve and to give thanks for what he receives from the Father. So, in a sense, by the man, and the man being the priest, the man is not just being the image of Christ; he's being the image of the Father. And Christ being also the image of the Father, and the woman is, in a sense, being Christ-like and allowing him to be the image of the Father and taking the fatherly, the headship, the role of headship there. So it's not just, I think we can overdo this semblance that, Christ was a male and therefore a priest have to be male because Christ was a priest. Well, you have to look at what is a priest. Well, it's that self-giving, that self-sacrificial role that Christ does for the church, and that we're just plainly told in Ephesians 5 that the man does for the woman there. But that self-sacrificing or that self-giving role is in a sense the one way of behaving, but the response to that is that thanksgiving. Christ also does that. So that's no less Christ-like for the woman to take the role of supporting her husband, being submissive. That's Christ-like also. And so they're both being Christ-like in taking these different roles.
Okay, next question. We got to go a little bit quicker on the answers because we're running pretty late.
Well, that was an important one I wanted to mention.
That was important. That was important. Why do they want to bring deaconesses back? Is it purely political, or is this woke ecumenism?
Plus both, I guess you could say that.
See the slippery slope argument as it always proves true when liberals ask for reasonable small changes in the political arena. Yeah, we've kind of established that this is definitely a slippery slope. We have a question. We have a question from our Crowdcast platform, and that is, St. Elizabeth Convent in Minsk has a lay sisterhood. This would be a wonderful here in the United States. A lay sisterhood. Thank you for the, Elizabeth, for the comment. And yeah, there is such a thing. Of course, there's such, in Russia, there's a lot of sisterhoods and brotherhoods that are very active. We don't have many of those in the United States, in my experience, but.
A lot of parishes have sort of women's groups that do things. That's great.
Yeah.
You need the fellowship, and there's a lot that they can do for the church, for other people.
My local Greek Orthodox church has a woman up near the priest to the far right, reading, singing through the liturgy. Is this wrong?
Really, singing through the I'm trying to picture what she's talking about.
She's basically up on the chanter stand.
On the kleros. Oh, you have a chanter, female chanters, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Is that they pretty much, I've seen many churches, they've sort of given that over to women. Women want to do it. No one will tell them no. And then when women learn to do it, well, it's so technical. Greek chanting is so technical that it's not something that a man can easily step into. And a woman may take the time to actually learn all the technicalities of it, and she'll take it over. And then it's like, well, does a man really want to submit himself to her tutelage in order to do it? It becomes a thing for women to do. They take over the singing of a parish, the chanting of a parish, by getting themselves involved like that. And there's a good chance that you just won't get men. Men don't aspire to be women. And when women move into a profession, men historically would move out if it becomes just a thing that is seen as something for women to do. I've seen that in Roman Catholic parishes too, women taking over the chanting. The only man with any manly role in a mass that I was at once was the priest. He was from the Philippines. He looked like an alien, actually, among all these Anglos in Arlington, Virginia.
In Greece, the way things have been dealt with up until when I left 5 years ago, and what I was told by spiritual fathers is that if there are no men and you can't do a divine liturgy otherwise, then by economy you can have a woman or your presbytera or somebody fill in. As long as there's a man who can chant, then the man should chant. So that hierarchy and that is kept. And I don't think that's really been violated in Greece. Maybe there's some things in Athens going on and places like that. I mean, certainly there are modernizations going on, I'm sure, in big cities. But in Thessaloniki, where I lived, I never saw a woman chant, except if there was some parish priest where there was just the priest, and literally the only people in the church were women, because many times during the week all the men were working, and he wanted to do a divine liturgy, and I think that's perfectly acceptable for the divine liturgy to happen. But they didn't then take advantage of that. They weren't feminists. They weren't trying to change the church through that. They were pious women, and so you got to examine the motivations and the trends and the mentality. It's in one case it could be blessed, an economy. In another case it could be an overturning of things intentionally for nefarious reasons. So. Small groups with hidden agendas can manipulate social media to make it seem that this is more desired than it actually is. Indeed. What is the church's view on Alcoholics Anonymous? What are Father Peter's anecdotal thoughts on the 12-step program, if he has it? I don't have a lot of experience with it. I was in Greece for 20 years. I never heard of it in Greece, never saw it. So if you have any thoughts on it, by all means.
No experience with it.
Yeah. I think insofar, the only thing I know is this: insofar as it's mimicking and following the Christian methodology to overcome the passions, then it probably has some good things in it, and that's why it's been successful for some people's lives. But we have all that in the church. Alcoholic, the drug of alcohol or other drugs, sexual drugs, they're similar in the suffering of the human being is similar. So the church has answers to all of how to overcome the passions and be free of the passions. I think that it's applicable then for alcoholics as well. So in roll call, we see women sell attendance to bishops. Why is this okay?
What? Who? I've never seen that.
Women sell attendance? That would be a scandal, wouldn't it?
I've never heard that.
Maybe there's some innovation going on there. We need to be careful. I don't know. Good evening. Is there any correlation between the influx of converts from Protestantism in recent years and this push for deaconesses in the Orthodox Church?
Most of the advocates for deaconesses I know of are cradled. They've been people who've raised with a very modern feminist form of Orthodoxy, and or whatever Christianity, and they're just impatient with the fact that it hasn't progressed as fast as they would like over their lifetime. I'm sure we get some converts come in expecting the church to change, but most of the people we get are coming wanting tradition rather than wanting to undo tradition. Yeah,
totally. Unless, and maybe this was going on in the Greek Archdiocese, they're marrying in to already feminists who are grown up in a very liberalized church environment, and now they're marrying, and they're also very, and that kind of conversion doesn't necessarily bring people in for the right reasons always. So maybe that's what the person's referring to. I don't know. Should women be reading the epistle or during Lent the Psalms during church services?
It used to bother me. It doesn't bother me near so much anymore in the context of a Roquefort parish where there's still a very active, minor orders for men. And so having women chanting some of the Psalms from now and then is not such a problem. The epistle, however, we never let women read the epistle, except if there were just no men available to do it. That's something I've never seen in a Roquefort parish, and I wouldn't expect to see it. But some other little chanting for the hours, yes, sometimes the women read the hours. We do make, however, a great effort to get men tonsured, so that we do have tonsured trained male readers, and that they pull most of the weight on the job.
I think it depends on the context. Roquefort, in your experience, that if you go to some of these Greek parishes, there's that what he's talking about is a concerted effort to be equal, and all the ideas that are floating around in the country, in the society, are being incorporated. So in that case, it's really egregious, but maybe in other cases, it's not.
Yeah, if I might raise one related issue there that we haven't talked about, and it's kind of surprising that more people don't talk about it, but the Apostle Paul says that a woman should not exercise authority over a man, and yet we have a lot of female choir directors there, and choir directing is a difficult job. It requires technical training. It's also a dangerous job in the sense that you spend your entire time with your back to the altar telling other people what to do. So it's a terrible temptation. And women generally, I've known some great female choir directors. I've also known some who didn't quite know how to treat men and drove all the men out of the choir because they treated them like children. And while definitely sometimes, since it does require training and ability, you may not have a man available for that job, and you may have to use a woman. Nevertheless, we should always keep in mind that it actually would be better if it were done by a man. It's more natural. It's more respectful of the order. It's a fallen world. Things are not always as they should be. And so sometimes, yes, you have to recruit women for it. But you can't just give up on the principle and not pay any attention to it thereafter, because then you're just sowing the seeds for undoing everything.
Yes. So really, the context and the leadership is key. And my parish, there's a spiritual child of Elder Ephraim. He specifically told her, and it has been relayed to my wife, not to commune during their period, the woman's period. There's no question. Okay, thank you very much. Father, is the reason that we are allowed to make icons and not have it violate the second commandment's part where it says not to make an image of anything in heaven above is because Christ glorified? Okay, some little difficulty with the English. The person writing doesn't know English so well, but do you understand the question? He's asking for the reasons why we can venerate icons, I guess, or make icons. So this is a question of iconoclasm and what's.
Oh, Yeah, I'm not sure really what the issue is there. There is a difference in icons and idols, and of course the icons are a testament to the incarnation of Christ, the physical reality that this good God created is good. It's never been really an issue with me, I guess. I've never seen a problem with icons.
Well, not only does the Seventh Ecumenical Council say that it's good, it says that it's essential that we venerate them. If we don't venerate them, we're anathematized. So that should point you to the reality of the incarnation, that by venerating the icons, we're confessing the incarnation. We're confessing that Christ became man and we can depict him. The second commandment is before the incarnation. It's not referring, obviously, to the incarnation, which is the whole theology of Saint John Damascus, Saint Uranos, Saint Theodoros. If you read any of those treatises, you'll get the answer to your question there. Next question. In Australia, on our driver's license, we have the option to donate our organs and tissue. Is it okay to do so? They tell us that it is to help others improve and save life. I can tell you that right now, that unless we're talking about those organs, one does not need to live. So what is the organs that we have two of? But just the name just escaped me. That we can give and still live.
Kidney,
yes. So unless it's that, the organs that you're giving are going to be taken from you while you're alive. Otherwise, they're useless to the person who's going to take them. And so the Orthodox Church, as far as I understand it, has been against it, because that means you're killing someone. The body is still alive, the heart is beating. And the reason why they created such a thing as brain death, the idea of brain death, which the Orthodox Church does not accept or embrace, because the brain is not the test of one's alive or dead, it's the heart. So they want a beating heart to be able to get the organ and put it in another person, and for that person to be able to use that organ. So I would say no, it's not a good idea to sign that off and put that, because they're not going to take it unless you're still alive. My understanding. Okay. It's interesting we're having this conversation the day we commemorate Saint Theosophia, a sister of Saint Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Paul of Sebastia. Okay. On the new calendar, probably. Is there an official Orthodox canon? I'm currently a Protestant who has recently become extremely interested in Orthodoxy, but haven't found any explicit view of the canon of Holy Scripture.
Oh.
There's an official Orthodox canon, as far as I know. Of course there is. I mean, but it's what we use, the gospel we use on Sunday, and what's been passed down, and the books in the Bible that we use in the church. I mean, I can't name them off by heart right now, but is there somewhere to point him in English? Is there that you know of? The Orthodox Bible, or whatever. The
Orthodox Study Bible. I still prefer the King James myself, but anyway.
No, I'm not saying the translation is preferred. I'm just saying that would be the list of canonical books.
Oh yeah, it does have that. Yeah.
As a catechumen, so bear with me. I'm a catechumen. It doesn't make sense to me that you can't take the Eucharist if you are bleeding or sick. We didn't say if you're sick. Never say sick. No. Isn't the point to touch Christ and be healed by Him, like in Luke 8:43-48?
Right. Yeah. Well, you can be sick. No, it's just that if you're bleeding, if you're suddenly bleeding in the altar, if you cut your hand in the altar, you have to leave the altar. And you wouldn't serve if you were bandaged with a cut and you could see the blood on the bandage. You might have a small cut on the finger. That's definitely a reason for not bringing blood into the altar. You don't want to be dripping blood in the altar. But yes, I mean, of course, we commune people who are wounded and in the hospital.
Who are sick. Of course, you're gonna.
Or sick.
She was sick. She was sick, and she had an issue of blood. She touched him. Now we're talking about communing of him and his body and blood becoming one with ours. Not exactly the same. At my parish, we're very realist in the Orthodox Church, right? We're realists. This is not a symbol. This is realism, and that's shocking for many people. It's a scandal for the rationalists to be become an Orthodox Christian, you have to crucify your intellect on these things and realize that there's a realism, and we take it seriously. And my parish, they have started allowing women to hold the communion cloth. Is this something to have concern over?
Yeah, I'd ask the question is why? Why do women need to hold the communion cloth? And it's interesting too, is how many chalices do you have that you would need women to come and assist with something like that? It all comes out of this idea that, we've got to make a room for women. We've got to give women liturgical roles because they're left out. As if singing in the choir, as if worshiping among the people and singing among them, because I think the people should be singing also. That's what the rubrics all say, the people, doesn't rather than the choir. But it acts like that unless you're holding the cloth or holding a fan or doing something that you're not really participating. But everyone should be participating through prayer and singing. What more do you need? So why do we have to invent duties for women to give to women, to take them away from men so that we can have women do them? That's what this is all about. This is incremental feminism there. And this feeling that we owe something to women, so we've got to give them a job, a liturgical role, as if being there worshiping and singing in the choir is not enough for them.
I think it's also, yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a breakdown in serious young men serving the church, going to, taking it seriously to become deacons, subdeacons, readers, and all the rest. And if that was not a problem, this probably wouldn't even be an issue. So we're kind of opening it up through our worldliness.
Yeah.
Let's see, what does it mean? Like a safety concern? I'm not sure what that means. Did I miss the previous question? There is this question. I think we're pretty much gonna wrap it up here. One or two more questions, Justin, and then we're gonna wrap it up for the night. It's been a good 2 hours and a half going. When is the Deaconess panel? I think it's on the 30th.
The 30th, right? Check
it out over at. I don't understand this question. I guess maybe it was hit on accident. Huh? Here it is. Yeah, there we go. I think the question should be: is there a necessity? And if there is, what can we do to remedy this so there is no longer the necessity? Maybe he's talking about what we just said. Women serving different roles.
Yeah. Well, there's no necessity for women to do things than they're already doing. They're there to worship, to praise God, to pray. That often involves singing. I think it should involve singing. Everybody should sing if they possibly can, in my opinion. But that's the necessity. Well, that's what you need to save your soul. Women don't need to be pushed into any other roles just to make them feel good, to make them feel like, well, what they were doing before, worshiping, praying, is not enough. You serve when you're needed, and if you've got men to do it, then you don't need women to do it. And men do have a responsibility, and we need to raise them to expect that responsibility, to take the lead. And the churches, again, that where families are a lot healthier when the man is actually very involved and taking the lead in things. When you start giving over his role to the woman, especially in churches, it's like you're just basically displacing men, and you give them less of a chance to be involved in church. Men will rise the occasion if you make an issue of it being a thing for men. It's like recruiting for the military. If you want to recruit men for the military, don't go advertise for women, because men don't want to be women. And yet, of course, our military, being so woke, puts women in every ad. Well, they're just shooting themselves in the foot, to use a military phrase, because they're basically making it into a thing for women rather than a duty for men, which it really is properly a man's duty.
Thank you so much for joining us, Brother Patrick. I think it's been a fantastic introduction for everyone into the problem and the solution, the teaching, the ancient teaching, the contemporary attempt to restore it, but not on the same basis at all, or according to the same principles and outlook. For everybody who wants to learn more about Father Protodeacon Patrick Mitchell's books, you can go to this website, brianpatrickmitchell.com. If you would like to purchase the book, I think we said earlier, that it can be found on right here on Amazon.
Yep.
We're talking about the disappearing deaconess, why the church once had deaconesses and then stopped having them. You can get that right now over at a Kindle price of $5.99. That's pretty good. That's pretty good price for Kindle, and then $24.99. I hope you all go over there, check it out, buy it, educate yourself. Especially if you're in a parish where this is a problem, and we have essentially erosion is going on. I think you need to educate yourself in order to give a good word and an apology for the holy tradition of the fathers. But everybody is co-responsible. Everybody should feel these kind of innovations and departures deep in our bones as a problem, because sicknesses in the body are going to circulate. You're a foot, and it's far away from you on the the other side of the body, but it circulates. It's all one body. The blood circulates. So you've got to be very cognizant that we're co-responsible. Let's see, we have one last. Do we have one last comment or one last statement, Justin? Do we want to put? I'll let you make the decision. Okay, this looks like one last comment here. Should we move to the true Orthodox Church if we start seeing female priests? I think somebody already answered this, but the answer is
you're no longer in the Orthodox Church if you've got female priests. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then that's so. I don't think that's going to be an issue, but he's talking about the various old calendar jurisdictions with broken communion and with the local churches. Is that that kind of thinking is probably not the best kind of thinking. It's not going to be the patristic way to approach things, but. I don't. Do you feel like that any of these jurisdictions could arrive at female priests anytime soon?
Not in my lifetime. No, I don't expect that yet.
Yeah, I can't see it either. Even if they do introduce some kind of deaconesses, I don't think, unless they really take a dive quick. I mean, that would be surprising.
It may take another generation before that actually gets forced.
I think a lot of other things are going to happen between now and then.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Father Patrick, for joining us, and God help us. And hopefully, this has helped a lot of people to understand the boundaries that the fathers have laid down on these matters.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.
Externally,